Hi, my name is Olivia Benbow, and I will be analyzing my Unit 1 assessment. This is given to fifth graders around this time every year, and our big focus is on fractions. They fall under five big main ideas, which are comparing fractions, adding and subtracting with unlike denominators, adding and subtracting with mixed fractions, adding and subtracting with mixed fractions that have or need regrouping, and then presenting students with real-world problems that include fractions. Um, Looking at our table here, you can see on the left it says our student name, and then the score for each content or big idea is right underneath it. If you go all the way down to the bottom, you'll see the total possible points. So for comparing fractions, the total possible points was 4, and you can see student number 1 only achieved 2 out of the 4 possible points. It also tells you the class average down here at the bottom as well for your reference. The colors can be a little confusing, but the colors help me with the standards-based grading that my district uses. We go from a 4, 3, 2, and 1. So the 4s are blue, if that's what they would have earned in based on the total points that they could have earned. Green is a 3, yellow is a 2, and 1 is a red. The zeros would also earn a 1 as well because we don't give zeros, but they're shaded in gray just so I can see which students got no answers correct. Looking at the data analysis part, I think my data really just stands out is that comparing fraction side. I'm really surprised that my students remembered comparing fractions. That was the very first thing we did, which was probably like the second or third week of school. And for them to be successful, or the majority of my students to be successful in that area compared to the other areas was really surprising. It also tells me that there were a lot of students that just were not close to grade level at all. If I'm looking at the total of meeting this standard, so all of these ideas fall under one standard for fifth grade, and there's only 3 students that would be close to meeting it, and then 1 student that is not quite there yet. And then the rest of my students wouldn't have met it at all. Same with over here, there's only a couple students that have met this standard or would have met the eligible content for adding and subtracting those unlike fractions. For the content moving to the right, I'm not surprised that as we move to the right, less and less students are meeting that standard. As we go to the right, that goes through the difficulty, especially with the addition and subtraction of real world problems. This is something that all of my students struggle with, especially at the beginning of the year. My students are able to know the procedure for what they should do, so they could add or subtract the fractions for the most part, but most of them don't know what the problem is asking. So it may not be asking them to subtract, it may be asking them to add or to do a multi-step, and they don't know what it's asking. And they're really struggling with taking that procedure and then applying it. But again, this is something that most of my students struggle with, especially at the beginning of the year. What does this say about my teaching? I think it says that my students really struggled with this content. And other than the comparing fractions, I'm not surprised. This is our first unit, and we start this like the 4th day of school. And my students definitely struggle, especially being part of the pandemic. So they lost half of their 3rd grade, and my district was virtual, half of their 4th grade, and we did hybrid for a period of time. So they just weren't learning the way that they typically learn. And knowing that they missed their basis fraction or their introduction to fraction is in 3rd grade, and so they missed that with the pandemic the first round. So knowing that coming in, I'm not surprised that they didn't do that great on it. However, when they do come in next year, I think I'd like to slow down a little bit instead of jumping right into the content and do a little more pre-teaching about fractions and that concept before moving in. I think a lot of my students are struggling with that addition and subtraction just because conceptually they don't understand what a fraction is. A lot of them, and they don't understand how to to find the common denominator and do all of that because it doesn't make sense to them conceptually what a fraction is. And so knowing that and going back and teaching that next year, I think that would help to kind of push my students along. I also am planning on doing some reteaching. I've broken them up into groups based on this data, and I'm going to start pulling groups next week for students to get some reteaching or some practice with the concept of fractions. So my students this student here who got essentially just zeros across the board, she would start with basics fraction activities conceptually so that she gets it. My students who are a little bit higher, they would do just some practice on the concepts that they just struggled with the most. I think one of the other factors that played into this data is my district took PSSAs in the fall. We started PSSAs like the second week of school, and the way that it worked was these kids, they're in 5th grade, but they took 4th grade PSSAs. So they had 3 weeks of PSSAs, plus I had about 6 kids quarantining. And then PSSA makeups also took a lot of time and kids were being pulled out. And so they just hadn't had a normal schedule, and because of that I could not start small group instruction just because we weren't having a consistent schedule, and I wasn't having the same kids consistently in my class every day. And I think that would have really improved instruction for those kiddos. Specifically towards the end, the small group instruction didn't start till about 2 to 3 weeks till the end of it, and I think it was just too late. We were already too deep into the content that was building. And I think had I started it earlier, I would have been able to teach those strategies and recognize, like, my students who didn't have those conceptual understanding, recognize them and impact them and teach them a little bit sooner instead of reteaching, which is happening now, just because I would have them in a smaller group to be able to do that. Thanks for watching my analysis, and I look forward to looking at yours.